The Legal Cheek podcast is sponsored by Simpson Thatcher, home of the private equity training contract. Hi, and welcome again to the Legal Cheek podcast. I'm Alex Aldridge, publisher of Legal Cheek, and with me is Julia Szaniszlo, one of our writers. How are you doing, Julia?
Yeah, not bad, thank you. Bit warm.
It is, it is. So today we are talking about the outgoing UK Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and how there is such a gap between the perception of Keir Starmer as a kind of not very popular, kind of nerdy figure who's failed to communicate well with the British public, and the popular perception of barristers, because Keir Starmer is, of course, a barrister, as kind of charming, charismatic individuals who are great at communicating.
Well, I suppose like most people, this before you even know anything about the legal world, the stereotype of the lawyer is always the best of the person who stands up in court and can sway a jury and is able to be, as you say, charismatic and well-spoken and appeal not only to the reasonable judge, but to the emotive and emotional jury. And I definitely did consider the barrister route. I think you'll be disappointed to find out that my considerations were mostly practical. I looked at the chances of becoming a barrister and the chances of securing a pupillage and how long it took and thought, my goodness, I'm neither charismatic nor successful nor accomplished enough to beat those odds. So I suppose it formed a part of my thinking in the sense that I thought, barristers are supposed to be almost superhuman. They have to beat such odds to get into that world. They must be absolute, mad, intelligent people who are able to speak off the cuff in a way that is not only eloquent and well thought out, but also interesting. And so I suppose it is a bit confusing looking at the kind of work that Keir Starmer has done in the past and the kinds of legal work that he's done, which has been very high profile and likely required a lot of, communicative abilities. And then seeing the way that he's presented himself throughout his political career. I mean, you think about, obviously there are certain things, that have happened during his tenure that have been less than ideal. You think about things like Mandelson, etc. But there have also been things that the Labour government have tried to really push through, changes of, when you think about the Renters' Rights Act, you think about the new, was it Employee Rights Bill, whatever, all that sort of thing. These are objectively good things, but they just haven't been presented in a way which has really tapped into the public's, emotions in any way, even though there are, good things that have come from these changes. And so I guess when I was deciding to go back to what my thoughts, I thought I enjoy public speaking. I like that sort of thing, but I feel like you have to be so good at it that I would need to work extremely hard to the point of, spending 5 years applying for pupillages, etc. So I didn't necessarily choose the solicitor route because it was the easier route, but more because it was the more straightforward, well-trodden
Okay.
path, especially when it comes to like outreach from law firms. Chambers are, they're these mysterious places that, as we've found
Yeah.
out the last couple of weeks, barely have marketing teams. They're very cloistered.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, and so you have someone like that. What do you think?
Yeah, it's kind of it's strange because you're saying you have this idea to become a barrister. It's so hard, and you have to have these kind of magical qualities of charisma, and and then you kind of see Keir Starmer, and you think, well, how did that happen? But I suppose that I mean, my response to some of what you're saying is perhaps you're kind of underestimating yourself because you're Cambridge graduate, top candidate, you've been scooped up by an elite US law firm. So, and I suppose Keir Starmer, I think he went to the University of Leeds, which is a good university, but it's not as good as Cambridge. And I think I think if you wanted to, you would get a pupillage and you could become a barrister if you wanted to go down that route. I think
Maybe in
probably
my
the way.
future.
I mean, I think you're going to have a great career, as a city lawyer. And so, I'm not saying that it would be a preferable route to go down. I'm just saying that's probably, I'm sure if you wanted to, you could, but I think probably things like the kind of perception of it, and well, I mean, some of it is the funding, isn't it? Because actually, there are these very generous Inns of Court scholarships that make it possible, but they're not promoted well. So a lot of students don't hear about them, whereas the global law firms talk a lot about they spend a lot more on marketing and explaining how they sponsor students and graduates through training contracts and law courses, etc. So that message is better disseminated. So logically, more people feel they're able to go down that route. I mean, I suppose the other thing with barristers is there's lots of different types of them. So from my experience of kind of dealing with barristers is you have like the kind of criminal barristers, who are a certain group of people who their expertise is speaking to juries, so members of the public, and some of those can be very charming, likable, and would probably, that some of their qualities will probably translate very well into politics, because I guess a jury is a kind of microcosm of the general public, and so I think that's probably very good training to be a politician. Whereas a lot of barristers, like most barristers, don't spend all their time speaking to juries. They spend they're civil barristers, so they spend their time arguing cases in front of judges, and judges are themselves just former barristers or even they can still be a barrister a bit, and they're a part-time barrister, part-time judge. And I suppose that lends itself more to having these kind of high-level conversations about the law, where kind of being charming or whatever isn't that important. It's more having a kind of clear mind and be able to kind of clearly communicate to kind of other people who are very well educated on that kind of high level. And I suppose that's the group that, looking at Keir Starmer's past he was a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers, and I think he did a bit of criminal law, but probably when he was quite junior, and then he seemed to focus quite quickly on kind of human rights, judicial review, kind of police law, which again would all be kind of civil cases where he'd be arguing in front of a judge, and I suppose that kind of popular touch with people, it's not that important, and perhaps you don't develop that well in those kind of roles. I mean, you should point out that I think Tony Blair was a civil barrister. He did employment, but I think he did various things, and he's obviously probably not the most popular person now, but he definitely did have the kind of popular touch back in his heyday. The thing that I've noticed as well with dealing with barristers is they often very good on the law, but they can have a very narrow focus that doesn't take into account the bigger picture. And but they're very, very good on a sort of narrow focused area. There's a story on this. I remember once negotiating with a senior barrister in the early days of Legal Cheek about a kind of commercial thing we were selling, and I remember him negotiating me so hard on what was actually quite a small amount of money, and you could see he thought he was being very, very clever of how hard he was negotiating. And in the end, I ended up getting a deal, and he really did squeeze me on what he was doing. And he lost so much goodwill in the process. And, just for the sake of what would have been quite a small amount of money, he could have maintained a lot more goodwill. And it was a good example of someone who sort of kind of missed the bigger picture. And I've seen that a few times with barristers. And critically, barristers outsource gaining work to their clerks, and the clerks are a group of people in chambers who essentially they bring in all the business and then they allocate it to the barristers, and the barristers do the actual work. And whereas solicitors are responsible for kind of bringing in their own business at the law firms, and as a result, they tend to be quite a bit more commercial. And I think the barristers often, I can understand why they structure chambers that way, and it works very well. But sometimes it would help them, I think, if they did get their hands a little bit more dirty in the sort of winning business side of things. And I think just watching Starmer, that's something that I've seen. He does seem to have lacked a little bit. Like, just, he used to always talk about how his dad was a kind of a tool maker and that kind of thing. And you just sort of think, it's a shame he couldn't have been had a bit more exposure to that world, because he did very much seem like an ivory kind of ivory tower barrister. I suppose there's a broader point in that, probably like being a politician is probably like, if you met Keir Starmer in real life, I imagine he would be like perfectly nice and probably like quite charming and like quite good company. But I suppose he's like, when you're at the top level of politics and you're it's probably like really a high standard. So to come across as like charismatic in that, at that level, you probably have to be like really, really, really charismatic. So it might be, to a certain extent, that perhaps you need a certain level as a barrister, but it just doesn't translate to the very top. I mean, a bit like a kind of what would happen if like a kind of good five-a-side football player was suddenly like playing for England at the World Cup. They just they wouldn't look that good. And maybe that's where Starmer suffered a bit. I suppose, talking about the kind of narrow focus of barristers and contrasting that with the kind of often the broader focus of solicitors, where they'll take into account the law, but they'll also take into account lots of kind of commercial and real world factors. It does surprise me that more solicitors don't go into politics. The trodden path is always from the bar to politics in the UK. I mean, there's some exceptions. I think like Sadiq Khan's a solicitor, Harriet Harman's a solicitor. In the current government, Lucy Rigby is a former lawyer at Slaughter and May. So there are solicitors, but there's far more solicitors than barristers. I think there's about 20,000 barristers versus about 200,000 solicitors, roughly. So, but yet barristers are more heavily represented in politics, which is kind of strange. I mean, I suppose that one part of it might be the money, as in once you kind of get locked into a city law career, becoming a politician would be a big pay cut. Whereas, Keir Starmer at Doughty Street, I'm sure he'd earned very well there, and then in a public service role at the CPS. But it wouldn't be the sort of levels that partners at city law firms are on. Indeed, a long way from it. I suppose the other thing, Julia, it's a bit surprising with Keir Starmer, is he was head of chambers at Doughty Street, wasn't he? And so it's kind of leadership role, and then he ran the CPS as the director of public prosecutions, for 5 years. So you kind of think you'd be a bit more adept at kind of leading an organization.
Yeah, I think the only thing that has stood out to me here is that whilst there seems to be this historic link between going from the law into politics, like you think about literal historic examples, like someone like Abraham Lincoln, who was an excellent public speaker and sharpened his public speaking skills, whilst he was a lawyer, and then used them, very effectively when he was, a politician. Is that it's a very different world that we live in these days. Appealing to the public using reason in the way that Keir Starmer has, being reasonable, is just not going to get you popular support, because people don't care about that sort of thing. They care about feeling a certain way, and there is obviously a group of the general public who, do pay attention to politics, do take into account the facts, if you will. but the majority of people don't. And I think the reason that Keir Starmer failed so spectacularly on this point is because he came into Parliament thinking, well, he came into the position, sorry, thinking, I'm just going to be the reasonable man. I'm going to be, the straight man. I'm going to play it safe because it's been so terrible with the previous government. Everything's been so topsy-turvy. If I come in as a voice of reason, then that's going to play in my favor. But that's just not the landscape of politics, even if it, could potentially work for him as a leader of chambers. Because I do believe that he was probably very good at his job, leading Doughty Street, co-leading it, I think, and as a director of public prosecution, because leadership in those spaces requires something quite different. Um, I don't know, but it is confusing that it didn't translate at least a little bit. You would have thought that he'd understand as by that point, established enough politician that it's a different skill set and it requires a different approach to, appealing to the public, I suppose, if that makes sense. Why do you
Yeah.
think it was that way?
No, I mean, I suppose we shouldn't be too harsh on him. I mean, you just
Yeah,
have to
exactly.
look at how many prime ministers the country's got through in the last few years. No one seemed to be able to really do the job. And you've got someone like as able as Rishi Sunak, and his party turned on him pretty quickly. And someone like Boris Johnson, who's obviously charismatic, just couldn't do the job. So, and I guess we might see with Andy Burnham, might it wouldn't be surprising if there's something similar that it's so 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 we shouldn't be too harsh on Keir Starmer. Perhaps it is kind of
It's poison
the
chalice, it seems, the premiership.
the impossible job. Um, I suppose just bringing it back to kind of to conclude with kind of the kind of careers advice kind of thing. So I guess obviously a lot of aspiring lawyers listen to us, and they um and they're making decisions about their career, and they're thinking, well, should I be a solicitor or should I be a barrister? And I guess one of the useful things to kind of take from this is, well, yeah, being a barrister it's not just for people who are like kind of mega confident, charming, kind of charismatic individuals. It's for, I suppose it's profession for people who are you're not just going to be talking to juries. Most barristers are going to be talking to judges. Some of the best barristers are just they love the law, and they're really good at communicating kind of complicated legal concepts and arguing the law to other effectively barristers, judges, and having these kind of high level conversations that can be quite narrow in their scope. And I suppose that so and I suppose kind of Keir Starmer's probably more an example of that kind of person. And I suppose a lot of students are put off from going to the bar because they think it requires these kind of, like you said, Julia, almost kind of superpowers. And it probably doesn't. It's probably people who are. It's probably a good career for the people who really love the law and more focused on that side of things. Whereas perhaps the solicitor profession is a bit better for people who are more, they like the law, but they're also interested in the bigger picture, interested in business in particular. If they're going into city law firms, like a lot of students are interested in doing. And I suppose I suppose that's an important thing. I guess the other thing is indirect. You mentioned it, but the funding aspect of going to the bar. I mean, these inter-court scholarships. I think the big deadline that's coming up is in October for inter-court scholarships, and they fund your law school costs, and they provide a level of funding which is just as good as law firms, and then the pupillage awards at Chambers often are quite generous. So you're earning similar levels to your trainee solicitor, in some cases more. So I think people certainly shouldn't be put off it from that perspective either. It'll be interesting to see what Keir Starmer does next. I think there are some rumours about him going back to the bar.
Yeah.
I think lots of politicians have done that. They've been at the bar, they've gone into politics, they've come back to the bar. I think there was a rumour about him going to the kind of International Criminal Court, something like that. Could be interesting. So it'll be very interesting to kind of follow Keir Starmer's next step. He certainly had a fascinating legal career, and we'll await that next move with interest. So thank you for listening today. The Legal Cheek podcast is sponsored by Simpson Thatcher, home of the private equity training contract. They've just launched their training contract in London, so do check that out on Legal Cheek on their firm's profile, and we'll be back soon.
Bye.